Hello and welcome back. Dear learners, so far we have learned about the Russian language, about its origin, the Russian alphabet, letters of the Russian alphabet. To understand in a more correct manner, we have also talked about the Russian consonants and vowels. As you already know that in Russian language, we have 33 letters in its alphabet, out of which 22 are consonants, 10 are vowels and 2 signs. Dear learners, to master the pronunciation of these letters, we have learned them with a few examples, so that you can pronounce these letters in a correct manner. With the help of such examples, it was also attempted that all these letters, while combined together, are to be pronounced in a correct manner, so that the individual sounds of these letters as well as when combined together are listened to properly. Dear learners, in this series we have also talked about the usage of words and expressions. In Russian, as we have used several words and expressions in our previous lessons, will help you in communicating in Russian in your day-to-day activities. Dear learners, we have also talked about the usage of personal pronouns and possessive pronouns in Russian. We have also made a few sentences like simple sentences, interrogative sentences, affirmative sentences and sentences with negation. We have also seen that how do we use the and niet in Russian. As you already know that da means yes and niet means no. Likewise, da and niet are used in affirmative and negative sentences. Dear learners, as we have been discussing about the role of verbs in Russian, as these verbs are action words which are used to express the exact meaning of the sentence. Further, these verbs are classified into perfective and imperfective verbs. As you already know that the conjugation of these verbs are based on the ending of these verbs, and these endings of these verbs are further classified accordingly. We have also seen that how we use the conjugated forms of these verbs in the form of sentences, and when combined together we have also listened to several texts. Dear learners, we have also talked about the usage of animate and inanimate things and beings in Russian. Animate and inanimate such as kto and shto in Russian are being used. Dear learners, as we have also talked about the usage of numbers, that is the cardinal and ordinal numbers, and the usage of days of the weeks and months of the year. Dear learners, so far as we believe that you must be having a notebook dedicated for the Russian language, where you must be writing your day-to-day communication and your day-to-day usage of words and expressions in it. It is strongly advised that you must use all these words, verbs and all new expressions which are being learned in this series, and you must use all these words, verbs and new expressions in your own communication. Dear learners, as we promised in the previous lesson that we will be discussing more about the usage of verbs of motion or glagoli dvizhenia as it is called in Russian in this lesson, as well as we will be talking about the usage of gijie and kuda. Gijie means where and kuda means where to. Such are the expressions which are very oftenly used in Russian, will be used in the form of sentences, as well as all these expressions will be taught to you in a correct manner. So, shall we go ahead? Dear learners, please pay attention to the slide as I read the verb for you. The verb is reach and itchy. As you remember that in the previous lessons, we have talked about the usage of verb conjugations in the use of simple sentences. We have also created our own sentences while using the conjugated forms in the ya, ti, on, ana, mui, we and ani forms. It was also advised to you that you must remember the sequence. Let us take the first example. The verb is reach, which means to live. Please pay attention to the verb conjugation and pronunciation while I read it for you. Я живу, ты живешь, он, она живет, мы живем, вы живете and они живут. Dear learners, likewise, like you have just seen, the next verb is idти, which means to go. As idти and khajij belongs to the same group of verbs of motion, here in this group we have two verbs, idti, which means to go on foot, and khajij, which also means to go on foot. But what is the main difference when we use these two verbs? These two verbs, idti and khajij, are being used only when we need to define the completion and incompletion of an action. For example, idti is used to indicate an action which is in progress. Khajij is used when we use this verb in a sentence which indicates completion of an action. Please pay attention to the slide while I will read this verb for you. Please pay attention to the verb conjugation and pronunciation. Я иду, ты идешь, он, она идет, мы идем, вы идете and они идут. Dear learners, as we have talked about the ending of these verbs like in reach and itchy, the ending of these verbs are to be remembered so that you can conjugate them in a correct manner. Let us go to the next slide now. Here we are using the two words gijye and kuda. The word gijye, which means where, and kuda, which means where to. These words gijye and kuda are used in our day to day communication. And what does it indicate? It indicates the location, whereas word kuda denotes destination and is used with the verb of motion like itchy, khajij and yekhaj. Yekhaj and yezjij, they belong to the second group of the verbs of motion. Since itchy and khajij means to go on foot, yekhaj and yezjij means to go by using a transport. Please pay attention to the sentences. Сейчас я в киоске. Whenever we are using a preposition, we are actually talking about preposition case and we are using the word gijye, which means where. Likewise, when we use, please pay attention to the next sentence, я иду в киоск. We are using a preposition, but the ending of the noun is not changing because it is the verbs of motion. Itchy and khajij. Here itchy is being used in a conjugated form and the question we are asking is kuda. Let us pay attention to the usage of these sentences. The first sentence is Сейчас я в киоске. If I am asking a question using this would be Где я сейчас? Я сейчас в киоске. Or сейчас я в киоске. Likewise, if we use the second sentence, я иду в киоск, I would ask, куда я иду? Я иду в киоск. And in the earlier lessons, if you remember that we have talked about gender in Russian language. As you know that in Russian language we have three genders. These are masculine gender, feminine gender and neuter gender. And accordingly, we have also talked about the agreement between the noun endings and adjective endings. For example, if I am using a masculine gender word like человек, I can use one adjective. For example, хороший. Хороший человек means a good man. Likewise, if I want to use another noun of feminine gender, let us use девушка. Let us also use the same adjective хороший for девушка, but in a feminine form it would change into хорошая. Хорошая девушка. For neuter gender, as we already know that nouns which are ending in ye, o and ea, they belong to neuter gender. Let us use the noun окно and an adjective большое. Большое окно, it belongs to the neuter gender. And if you remember that we have done a good number of such words and expressions which define their gender, and accordingly such adjectives were also used. We have also talked about the usage of interrogative words like какой, какая, какое and какие, какие which is plural. Rest of these three, they belong to masculine, feminine and neuter gender. Here again, when we are constructing a sentence, whether in the preposition case or in verbs of motion, we are using these conjugated forms of verbs according to the gender as well as the use in singularity and plurality. So, dear learners, let us go to the next slide. Here we have given a list of such verbs which are used in GGA. It is an indication that whenever GGA is used, we are talking about the prepositional case, as well as we are also have given a list of such verbs which are used with Kuda, which indicates that we are talking about the usage of verbs of motion. Please pay attention to the verbs while I read it for you. Verbs used with GGA and Kuda. The first group is GGA. Находиться, жить, работать, играть. Let us repeat. Находиться means to be situated at. Жить means to live. Работать means to work. And играть means to play. These four verbs, for example, can be used with GGA. I will give you a few examples of these. Please pay attention to the sentences and usage of such prepositions along with the usage of these verbs in these sentences. Дели находится в Индии. Here Delhi is the name of the city, Delhi, and we have conjugated it according to its gender. Delhi это город, that is why on. Находится is situated at where? Находится в Индии, in India, that is why the noun India changes into Inji when it is used with preposition v. Let us go to the next example. The next verb is жить. Let us take this sentence to use the verb жить in a conjugated form along with a preposition. Я живу в Москве. I live in Moscow. Я живу, as жить has been conjugated according to the form of я. Я живу. Gdzie ja живу. Я живу в Moskvе. Here the noun Moskva has been changed into Moskvе. Here we have used the preposition v again. If we pay attention to the next verb работать, let us use another example to understand the usage of verb работать. Мой папа работает на заводе. Here завод, which means a plant, an industrial plant, has been used with na. Here when we are using na, it is indicating the usage of a preposition at. Мой папа, my father, работает, it has been conjugated according to он. Где он работает на заводе. So, he is working at a plant or an industrial plant, you can use in your own sentence. You can also use these verbs in their own conjugated forms according to the personal pronouns from ya till ani, and you can only make your own sentences while using these verbs. Dear learners, whenever we are conjugating these verbs, we are also keeping in mind that these verbs are to be used in such forms where they qualify with the personal pronouns, and this sequence is to be remembered in a very efficient and correct manner whenever you are using their conjugated forms. Let us go to the last verb of the list of verbs which are used in GGM. The next verb is играть. Играть or means to play. Let us listen to the sentence while I use this verb in a sentence like дети. Дети means children, as you already know. Дети играют в саду. Here we have used an exception in Russian, as you know that sad is garden, but whenever it is used with a preposition it changes into sadu. Sadu, and the pronunciation of using v changes into f. Sadu. Дети играют где? Дети играют в саду. Accordingly, we have conjugated the form of verb играть into any forms, because дети is plural. Children are playing in the garden. So, accordingly, learners, we need to pay attention to the exact context as well as the usage of personal pronouns. According to the usage of personal pronoun, we need to conjugate the verb accordingly, and we need to use the exact preposition in making of sentences where we are using the verbs like жить, работать, находиться and играть, for an example. So, dear learners, now after using these four verbs, we have an idea that how we are going to use such verbs in our own daily communication, and with the help of this method you can also use such other verbs which belong to the preposition case, and you can make your own simple sentences and all such sentences which we made in our previous lessons. Now, let us go to the second group. As we have already talked about that we will be using such verbs which are used with kuda. As an indication, kuda is always used with verbs of motion like идти, ходить, ехать, ездить, etc. These verbs of motion are conjugated also according to their endings. Let us pay attention to the slide. Kuda, идти, ходить and ехать. As we have used the conjugation of идти and ходить in our previous lessons, идти we also conjugate them with the personal pronouns. Let us take a few examples to understand the usage of ichi and khajij first. Ya idu v park. Here, as a fundamental rule, we use preposition, but the ending of the noun does not change, as we have seen in the case of prepositional case. Please pay attention to the sentence. Ya idu v park. I am going to the park. So, here we have conjugated the first verb ichi according to ya. Ya idu kuda, ya idu v park. Let us take another example while I use the second verb khajij. Moj brat časta khodit v kino. Moj brat means my brother, časta khodit often goes to kino, at the movie. You can use here. Here we have used časta. Whenever such words are used, it indicates completion of an action, which means my brother has gone to the movie and came back. So, in Russian, it is to the benefit of learners. By using these verbs, you can exactly express that the right emotion has been used and expressed with the help of these categorized verbs. Let us go to the next verb, as we have talked about the usage of yekhach and yezdit. On yejit damoi, he is going home. So, here yekhach has been conjugated according to the usage of personal pronoun on. Kuda on yejit damoi. Accordingly, let us take another example of using yekhach. Luji chasta yedut Moskvu. Here, while using verbs which comes with kuda, all feminine gender words which are ending with a, ya and iya changes into u, you and eu. For example, kuda on yejit Moskvu. Kuda on khojit biblioteku. Kuda ani yedut vauji toriu. So, accordingly, here we have seen that how the ending of these nouns which belong to the feminine gender are changing into u, you and eu, like Moskvu, biblioteku and auditoriu. So, here you can also use all such verbs with the help of the particular nouns of masculine gender, feminine gender and neuter gender. Let us go to the next slide now and understand certain examples where we are using the verbs gijie and kuda. Please pay attention to the sentences while I read it for you. Gijie, дети играют в парке. Куда? Иван идет в парк. Here we are using the same noun park with preposition v, but with questions like gijie and kuda. If you pay attention to the ending of the noun park, in the first one where дети играют в парке has been changed into v parke, whereas kuda has been used in the next sentence. The noun park has not changed and it remains v park. It happened like because the noun which was used in the both sentences are park and it belonged to the masculine gender. Let us go to the next sentence now. Где? Maria живет в общежитии. As we know that in nominative form the noun общежитие is used in a simple manner like общежитие, but whenever the noun общежитие is used in preposition, it changes into в общежитии. Accordingly, when we are using it with the question где, it is changing as Maria живет где? Maria живет в общежитии. Let's see how it is used with куда. Инна Петровна работает в институте. Инна Петровна идет в институт. So accordingly, here we have used Инна Петровна. Она работает где? Она работает в институте. Here we have used it with the preposition in prepositional case, whereas in the second one, Инна Петровна идет куда? Инна Петровна идет в институт. Here the institute remains institute. It doesn't change again because it is of masculine gender. Dear learners, as we have seen that how the usage of где and kuda is being used in Russian language and how clearly it indicates its own meaning. Dear learners, whenever in Russian language we are using such expressions where we meant to say that where I am situated or where to I am moving or going, where we indicate a movement, we always use different set of verbs. These verbs, as we have just learned, like работать, жить, находиться, играть, etc. are used in prepositional case or used with the question где, whereas verbs like идти, ходить, ехать and ездить are used with verbs of motion, of course, and with the question куда. Dear learners, since Russian language consists of such many other expressions, but to simplify them in a correct manner and with efficiency, you can also use these new verbs, words and expressions in your own sentences. That is why we have given a good number of examples where we have also used nouns which belong to different genders, so that you can exactly understand how to use these verbs with different genders of the nouns. We have also used several adjectives according to their genders, and that is why, so that in Russian itself, as there is an agreement between the adjective endings and noun endings, you can also use them with your own sentences. Dear learners, now since we have learned about the usage of где and kuda, in the next lesson we will be talking about the usage of где and kuda in a more efficient manner with detailed examples. I will conclude here. Thank you.